Members, on the House Bill 2429, it is changing the reduced rate on the gross production tax from 1% to 4%. Your operative language is on page 7, where it says that the production occurring on or after the effective date of this act, which is July 1, for the remainder of such 48-month period shall be subject to a reduced rate of 4%. With that, Mr. President, I move for adoption at the proper time and yield for questions.
Members, that concludes the explanation of the Joint Committee Report to House Bill 2429. Will there be questions to Senator Thompson? Senator Floyd, you're recognized for a question to Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. So we're dealing with gross production tax, but this isn't the gross production tax area that we currently refer to that goes from the 2% to the 7% after 36 months, correct?
Mr. President, I thank you for the question. You are correct. Before 2015, we offered an incentive package. And that incentive package, they would go ahead and they would pay the 7%, then of course we'll go back to the 1% as the bill stipulates. In 2015, it was put into statute that the rate would be 2% for 36 months, and so it's two different parts of the same statute.
For a follow-up, Senator Floyd, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. And if I understand correctly, this is going to be an increase on existing wells that we already have. I believe they were drilled between 2011 and 2015, existing wells.
Mr. President, thank you for the question. Yes, these are existing wells that are now paying at 1%. If they got in exactly in 2011, whenever we started the process, then of course they'd be going off to this pretty quick. They got in 2015 with 2 more years that would be on these wells.
Senator Floyd, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. And do we have any idea how many wells, existing wells, that this is going to affect that we're talking about?
Mr. President, I thank you for the question. Senator, I had that information in my office. I'm going to tell you it's somewhere around about 4,700, if I remember correctly.
Senator Floyd, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. And does this bill in any way deal with what we were discussing just a minute ago about the gross production tax that we have on new wells that's 2% for the 36 months before it jumps to 7%? This bill does not cover any of that or change any of that, does it?
Thank you, Mr. President, for that question. Senator, if I could answer that in 2 areas. The part of this bill that is amended does not deal with that area of the 2% and going to 36. It is in this particular statute that the 2% is codified for the 36 months. But what we're addressing today, we are not addressing that part of this bill.
Thank you.
Further questions? Senator Dossett, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Since this doesn't affect most wells, could we consider this long-term or recurring revenue, or is this just a short-term fix?
Mr. President, I thank you for the question. Whenever that we deal with the gross production tax, we look at this last year. Our 1% wells brought in about $67 million. Our 2% wells, Mr. President, that we hear a lot about, only brought in about $11 million. Our 4% wells brought in this last year a little over $2 million. Our 7% wells this last year brought in $271 million. And so whenever we begin to look at what will this impact our budget, it will impact our budget of $93 million a year for the next 2 years. Whenever that you talk about whether this is a short term or a long term, $93 million a year to me is a lot of money, and 2 years is a long way off.
Further questions? Are there further questions? Senator Floyd, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. That caused me to have another question. So we're looking at these wells that have been drilled between 2011 and 2015. So the newest one of these wells would be right about 2 years old, correct?
I'm sorry, Senator, can you repeat?
We're looking at wells that have been drilled between 2011 and 2015. So right now, calendar-wise, the newest one of these wells would be about 2 years, been producing for about 2 years, correct?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. And Senator, you are correct. And by the way, I want to correct the figure that they have given to me. We have 5,790 wells currently at 1%.
Senator Floyd, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. So if the newest one, most recent one of these wells that was drilled has been producing for about 2 years, is it accurate to say that about 70% of all production takes place in about the first 18 months?
Mr. President, I thank you for the question. Senator, my expertise is not in the oil field business. I think you and I would both know that at the beginning they might have more production. I think what is also that we need to keep in mind here that if we leave the bill as it is now, they're going to stay at 1% until they go off. And then they're going to 7%. We're going to go ahead and bring them to 4% now, and then they will go to 7%. And so if we waited until they completely expired at the end of the 4 years, they would have less oil in them than they have today. And so by us going to 4%, we'll capture more of the tax revenue than we would if we did not vote yes on this bill.
Senator Floyd, you're recognized for a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate your indulgence and also the indulgence of my colleague presenting the bill. I guess my question is simply, I just want to be clear, or understand that I'm clear that we're looking at wells that are at the minimal production level now simply because of the production life of the first 70% production in the first 12 to 18 months. So we're looking at wells that, although they're still producing, they're producing at a much lower rate because they've already passed through that cycle. Would that be accurate?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Again, when I go back in, I don't know what the production rate would be. I do know, just from my study this year, that these wells produce $67 million in gross production tax for the revenue for the state. They're still producing. They're still doing well. And so we feel like that if we move forward with this, it not only will help the state at this time, but again, as I stated a few moments ago, let's capture the gross production tax that we have on the wells while they're still as lively as they are.
Further questions? Are there further questions? Senator Bass, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. So, Senator, that means that there's 4,700 wells. Each well pay less than $20,000 a year. Is that correct?
Thank you, Mr. President, for that question. Senator, I'm sure that they produced at different levels, and I trust your math if you want to divide those out during that particular time. You may be close there. I'm sure as they produced different volumes of oil, different well would pay just a little bit different.
Further questions? Are there further questions to Senator Thompson? Seeing no further questions, will there be debate on the conference committee report? On the joint committee report, excuse me. Seeing none, Senator Thompson moves adoption of the conference committee report. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Those opposed, nay. Ayes would have it. The ayes do have it. Joint committee report is adopted. Remember, House Bill 2429 is now before you on third reading and final passage. Will there be debate? Will there be debate? Seeing none, the vote will now occur. If you favor the measure, vote aye. If you oppose the measure, vote nay. Clerk will open the roll. House Bill 2429 has received 37 ayes and 7 nays. Here will declare the same to have passed.